So I'm still letting people in. We're up to 62, 63.
Fab. Excellent. Thanks to the people that are just joining us. Say hi in the chat while we're getting going, and then I'll pop up some slides and we'll make a start. I'm really, really pleased with how popular this session is, actually. It's probably, from the sign-ups, Sam, I think it's probably one of the most popular ones that we've run through the Evaluation Collective. So I'm really, really pleased that people can join us today. Okay, I'm going to pop up some slides, and I'm going to do some introductions, and I'm going to let people know what we're going to be doing for the next hour and a half. And hopefully you've all come along with some questions and some thoughts and some ideas for our wonderful speakers as well. So just let me share my screen, and then we'll make a start.
So it just needs to be on presentation mode.
Yeah, there we go. Does that look all right, Sam?
Yeah, that looks great.
Perfect. Okay, so I will make a start, and I'll do some brief introductions before we get into the kind of main event for today, which is to talk to some senior leaders about evaluation, which is, as I said before, a really hot topic for us at the moment. And judging by the interest for this session, it really is with you as well. So first of all, to introduce myself, myself and Sam, who've been kind of organising this event, and you'll have got some communication and messages from us in the run up to this event. So my name's Liz Austin. I'm one of the founders of the Evaluation Collective, and currently kind of co-chairing the Evaluation Collective with Sam Child, who's also on the call, and lots of members of our small steering group are also on the call today. So we've got a small steering group of about 14 people, and this is where we kind of cook up these ideas of things that we might want to talk to the sector about, where we bridge that gap between policy and practice, really. And that was one of the reasons why we set up the Evaluation Collective back in 2021. So we've got an hour and a half for this session today, and this was one of the sessions that we'd thought about as a steering group, as something that we wanted to bring to the sector and the sector UK wide. So you'll see from our speakers today that we are, as the Evaluation Collective does, thinks about evaluation in the context of all the kind of nations in the UK. So we'll get some really good kind of cross-sector perspective today, I think. So just as I've mentioned, this meeting is going to be held in Zoom. It's in the meeting platform, so this is not a webinar. You've got access to your microphone and your camera, and it'd be really lovely to see people. We've also got the chat if you want to leave messages in the chat. Say who you are and where you're from. That would also be lovely. Please, if you could keep your microphone muted during the kind of presentations and through our speakers, that would be great. But you're very, very welcome to come in and ask questions after each one of the speakers today. But also, if you've got time at the end, it's also really lovely to hear your voices and reflections. I can see people, a few people, but I can't see the chat while I'm sharing slides, and that's just to. It's one of the intricacies of Zoom. I think that doesn't allow us to do that, but hopefully there's lots of things bobbing away in the chat as well as I'm speaking. So just a bit of an introduction as to what we're going to be doing today. I'll do a little bit of scene setting and a welcome, and talk a little bit about some of my reflections and those reflections from the Evaluation Collective as we've been gathering them over the few years that we've been in existence. And then we're really, really happy and grateful to our speakers that are joining us today. So we've got 4 speakers, and I'll introduce them each with a full kind of overview of their history and their expertise before each one of the sessions. But we've got Professor Jenny Marie joining us and will be talking to us first. Then we've got Professor David Shepherd. Then we've got Emma Thomas and Sam Child from Applied Inspiration. And then hopefully joining us at 11, he's currently in another event, but will hopefully, fingers crossed, be joining us. We've got Professor John McKendrick, Scotland's Commissioner for Fair Access, joining us at 11. So we will have time for questions and hopefully answers from our panel members as we're moving through. So we've got about 15 minutes for each slot for each presenter and to have a discussion. So please do either pop your questions in the chat and Sam and I will do our best to chair our way through that. Or if you want to come in and ask some questions directly, please don't leave us hanging in silence. I know that you've got lots and lots of thoughts on this, which is why you're here, I'm sure. And that should take us through to about 11:15 towards 11:30 today. So what I thought I would do just by way of an introduction is to just think a little bit about why we've put this session on and a little bit of a reminder of what the Evaluation Collective, I guess, set out to do. And, you know, we never wrote down our ambitions to be a body which talked about leadership or were leaders in the space, but you know, these things kind of organically emerge. So I thought it'd be useful to go back to the manifesto that we wrote back in 2021 to see what did we say, what did we think that evaluation was all about, what were the aims of that, and therefore how do we then place that in the context of leadership and senior leadership. So on the left-hand side of the screen, what you've got is the definition of evaluation from the Evaluation Collective that we kind of co-created through our steering group, and also had a few sessions with the sector to think about what how this definition could be applied. And we're really talking about an approach which helps to understand and explore what works and doesn't work in a given context and is of value to stakeholders. So the aim of evaluation is actionable, evidence-informed learning and continuous improvement of process and impact. And then I started to think about, as I scrolled through, I think, you know, the 10 or so points of our evaluation manifesto, I got to the one on the left is the very first point we make. And the very last point we make is about getting to a stage where we're considering our higher education institutions as learning and thinking organisations. So it really was to position evaluation as something which had value, but also we're thinking about the purpose of this. And one of my reflections was we didn't mention the word leadership within our evaluation manifesto. We didn't talk about the kind of mechanics of empowering others. It was kind of implicit in what we wrote. So we didn't specifically call that out. But I think that's perhaps one of the reasons why we're having this session today is to explore that in a little bit more detail. But then I started to unpick some of the things that we did say and how important having, you know, visible, valued support from senior leaders is really important. So we talk in our manifesto about the importance of building an evaluative culture, and we use the phrase an evaluative mindset. And we know, and I think we all know, and we've all been in these spaces and possibly still working in these spaces, that it's really important to empower and build kind of cultural change from the ground. But it's absolutely essential that we also have the support of senior leadership within an institution, or whether we're working in other sector spaces, organisations, or policy landscapes, to really champion that support and that commitment to an evaluative culture. So that could be reflected in something formal like a strategy, or it might be in the walk and the talk and the actions and the practice. But really having that support and buy-in from senior leadership is how we move towards the development of an evaluative culture. And maybe we get to the position on the right-hand side of the screen where we've got higher education institutions which are for thinking and learning. We also talk in the manifesto about funding and about how projects are funded and how that funding should be inclusive. And funding is often, well, certainly the pot of money that the funding comes from is often within the gift of our senior leaders. And one of the things that I think is implicit in what we're saying in our manifesto is that we really want kind of leadership to be setting expectations that funding comes with some kind of recognition that the use of that money, the project that has been supported by that money has an evaluative component to it. So only if we start to build in expectations for evaluation, you know, within our processes, our funding procedures, our practices, and building that in from the start, are we able to start to develop what I talked about in the first point, which is an evaluative culture. The other thing we talk about in our evaluation manifesto is language. And you'll remember many years ago when we first started talking about this, we were very, very vocal about our rejection of labels of evaluators being the kind of the nerdy kind of components of institutions. Those that did evaluation had a particular type, a particular skill set, a particular personality is what we read into that. But language is really, really important. What we call our work, how we define our work, and the identity of that is really important. And I think about language more and more, having moved from a role which had evaluation in the title, and even my professorial title has evaluation in the title, to a position now as an Associate Dean Teaching and Learning, where I need to think about language in a slightly different way. And I'm even starting to think about whether in all contexts, evaluation is the right word. And I never thought I would be there. So I think it's important that we think about what we're calling the work that we're doing, and the language that we're using, because that enables, from a leadership position, to think about how we develop buy-in, how we get that buy-in from others, and making sure that we're talking the right language to our audiences. Inquiry is something which I'm starting to use more, I actually think, than evaluation at the moment. I'm not going to give it up. I'm not going to give up the evaluation word, but I have to adapt in the different spaces that I'm now working in. So I think if we want to build that momentum, if we want to get to a space where evaluative thinking is just part and parcel of what we do, we have to, as senior leaders, think about adapting how we do that along the way. So there, I mean, just some of my reflections when I looked at the evaluation, the kind of manifesto that we wrote. It seems like a long time ago now, but the messages are still pertinent. I'm really, really pleased that others are also talking about this with us today. And I'm really pleased to be able to hear from our guest speakers in this topic. And hopefully you can debunk some of the things that I've said, or kind of add your own reflections to this. So I'm going to stop my sharing, and I am going to introduce our first speaker. So we have Professor Jenny Marie joining us for our first speaker. And Jenny, I'm just going to read out your bio that you sent over as a way of an introduction. So Jenny Marie joined the University of Greenwich in November 2019 and has been PVC Education at Greenwich since 2023. Jenny co-developed the University of Greenwich Student Success Sub-Strategy and is co-leading its implementation. Jenny is an active member of University Alliance PVC Teaching and Learning Network, having chaired the network and a working group on micro-credentials, and also a member of London Highers Equivalent Network. She has extensive experience as an academic developer with an international profile for students as partners work. So Jenny, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about the context of how we talk about evaluation within our senior leadership circles. So over to you. You've got until 10:30 for presentation and some questions.
Great. Thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me. A lot of what you said resonated. Some of it was quite new in terms of thinking of the language, so perhaps I won't pick up so much on that. One other thing to bear in mind, my internet seems to be a little bit unstable, so hopefully I'll be with you. If I cut out at times, you might need to just tell me to go back, so apologies for that. So I'll just share my slides. If you just give me a thumbs up if you can see them. Okay, excellent, good. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about work that we've been doing probably over the last year to get to where we are now in terms of trying to develop evaluation at the University of Greenwich. As Liz said, I came into post at the start of January 2023, so I've been in post for 18 months now. And I'll give you a quick overview of what I'm going to go through. So I'm going to talk about how we've been trying to establish an evaluation centre particularly focused on student success. That's the sub-strategy that I lead in terms of implementation. So I will talk through the drivers for trying to establish that. I'll spend quite a lot of time on the practicalities. I'm hoping that's of interest
Have we lost Jenny?
Yeah, I think we have. She's gone quiet.
I wonder if she can hear us. Hopefully she'll be back soon.
If not, I can fill some space if you like, Liz.
Yeah, go for it, Nathaniel.
I can try anyway. Might not be as impressive as Jenny. Have we lost Jenny's slides as well?
I think so.
I think so.
I can set some context then, maybe where the evaluation centre at Greenwich has come from. So just to introduce myself, I'm Nathaniel Pickering. I've just been appointed as the Associate Director of Evaluation at Greenwich. I started about 4 weeks ago, so everything still feels very new, but I think I can probably speak to some of the context and obviously some of the direction in which Greenwich has been moving. So about 3 years ago, I think they started a new strategy called This Is Our Time, and part of that was a core in there was student success. And that's now become a really key sub-strategy for the university, and it's a really focused with really clear directions of travel for the university. And part of that strategy was to embed evaluation within the student success interventions and also within the kind of delivery of that programme of change. And then that's kind of where the evaluation centre came from in those discussions, and also with the kind of requirements from the OFS around developing the teaching excellence framework and the access and participation plan. There was a real need or gap identified that there wasn't someone or somewhere to coordinate that work within the university, and also to kind of lead developing that culture of evaluation within the organisation as well. And so the thought came around developing a centre for evaluation, and that's where my role came from. And so probably just speak a little bit about how we're kind of envisioning the centre to go forward. At the moment, we've kind of landed on the name of the Student Success Evaluation Centre. So it's very much aligned with that strategy, with that focus really on students. And it's really, I suppose, speaking to lots of the collectives kind of manifestos as well. So we're trying to develop and support student success evaluations. So that's either with the centre delivering those, or with or in collaboration with other partners, both internally and externally. We want to facilitate an inclusive, collaborative and participatory approach or an evaluation culture. So that speaks very much to that evaluative mindset, but bearing in mind we want that to be facilitated between staff and students. And we want to enhance we want to enhance the evidence and impact of student success interventions, both within Greenwich and across the sector as well. And so that's about how we disseminate and use our findings. And one of the key things for the centre is about that application. And so part of my work at the moment, and I think this is really speaking to that leadership, I have a massive advantage, is that the leadership at Greenwich has already really bought into this agenda. So I think that is a really key thing here, but also that we can demonstrate impact, but also that we can show how we can apply our findings in the context of Greenwich and the sector. And I think that's a really key thing here, that when interventions are kind of articulated often, it's like, oh, we want to evaluate this thing, and then you write a nice report at the end, and that's like, oh, that's nice, but we're going to carry on doing what we're doing. And so part of that evaluative culture that we are aiming to establish at Greenwich is that when people kind of initiate an evaluation, that there's a commitment to change, or there's a commitment to apply those findings within that kind of within that area. I think was one of the things that seems a real key at Greenwich as well, is there's a really kind of direct leadership, but also there's real ownership from the leadership as well. So there's real direction on those kind of key activities. So whether that's the attainment gap, whether that's access into the university, there's a real clear leadership all the way up to the VC about who's responsible for those things.
Nathaniel,
And
I think Jenny's back with
sorry,
us now.
it's Jenny back. All right, sorry,
Yeah.
I'll stop filling time now.
No, you're
No,
very
no.
right.
Thank you, Nathaniel. And yeah, I've been sitting listening for the last few minutes, so it's been great.
Sorry, Jenny, I didn't
No,
see
no,
you
it's
there.
been it's been really good, and you good to hear that the leadership does come across as being engaged in evaluation, because I think it is. I'm not going to share my slides because I think it'll probably crash it again.
Yeah, go for it, Jenny. Yeah.
And that probably also allows me to be a little bit more flexible in what I'm saying. I'm going to go back a little bit. So Nathaniel's talked a little bit about some of the drivers for us. Some of those, there was a mixture of regulatory and kind of strategic drivers for us in terms of trying to strengthen the evaluation. So there were regulatory drivers. For Greenwich, we're in an English context, so apologies, I know there's people from some of the other nations here, but anyone in England will be really familiar with John Blake talking about evaluation. So we definitely did need to do something in terms of the access and participation plan. For me, I was sort of halfway through writing our TEF submission when I came into post, and it was really clear, particularly actually when we got our feedback from TEF, that some of the things that we thought we knew were excellent and were making a difference, actually we didn't have the evidence whether they were making a difference or not, and that just kind of wasn't good enough for two reasons. One, it wasn't good enough for trying to do TEF in 4 years' time or whenever that happens again. But secondly, and this links into those strategic drivers and perhaps what Liz was talking about earlier, it kind of was no good, because do we really know that they're making a difference? And how can we prioritize? And leadership is all about prioritization, and what are you going to do? What are you going to invest in? How can you do that if you don't know what's working and what's not working? And one of the things that drove me quite mad quite quickly was thinking about our funding model, because what we seemed to do was we just rolled over funding. So anything that had got to the stage where it had started, we just kept funding. And if you wanted to start something new, you had to make a case for that, which you often kind of couldn't without a pilot, and you couldn't necessarily get the money for a pilot to then evaluate and see whether it worked, because we were funding all these things that we weren't evaluating. So actually, when we were putting together the business case for this, not only did we draw very strongly on, well, we've got to do this for our access and participation plan, but we also drew really strongly on a case of, well, we can use this to improve efficiency, which might not always be the case that you want to make, but in a time of, where purse strings are really tight at the moment, and it's really hard to make a business case, it was very much about, well, what can we stop doing? Because actually it's not making as much of an impact for us. And what do we really want to go and invest our money in? Evaluation is actually really important in a time when you don't have much money. And I think it should help us to make that case for evaluation at the moment. And I can see that it's really easy to just say, well, that's something additional, let's get rid of it because it's costing us money. But really, it's a time when we should be investing more in this. And I think there is a strong case that we should be making for that. The other thing that I would say, because I think it links into the strategic drivers, is that we talk about evidence-based practice all the time, but how good are we? And this goes to Liz's point about learning organisations. How good are we as universities, which are all about learning, all about evidence practice, in actually taking forward that ourselves? And I think we've got to show some leadership and show that we really do value that. I know that I'm rapidly running out of time, but Nathaniel very kindly, I think, has set out kind of that vision, talked about, I think, some of the other context. I'm just going to check if there was anything else vital that I wanted to tell you. Probably not really. Might be better just to hand over for any questions.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Nathaniel. Yeah, it's absolute music to my ears, the kind of things that you're talking about, and the both the regulatory drivers, but also that recognition of how to sustain a learning organisation through that kind of evidence-informed practice. Does anybody have any questions for Nathaniel and Jenny, which we could field here? Anything anybody wants to ask about the development of their new centre or their strategy, sub-strategy?
I'm wondering, this is Sierra Smuckerheim from the University of Brighton.
Hi.
This sounds like a really amazing approach to evaluation, and the whole thing you both just laid out sounds really inspiring. I'm wondering how you put together the funding for a center. Did you draw on existing resources? Did you get something new? So I know you made a business case for it, but where did that money actually come from?
So we did make a business case and the money was new, but it was more of a kind of seed funding, I guess, in some respects. I think there's two things we need to do to expand it, and I think we do want to expand it as we go forward. One is we also presented it as an opportunity loss at the moment. So there are lots of calls from places like TASO. There are opportunities because across England, at least, everyone almost needs to be expanding evaluation. So we were talking about, actually, this is an opportunity for us to become a hub and a bit of a sector leader. And we can be doing work helping other institutions to evaluate the work that they're doing with their access and participation plan. So there's still a case to be made, I think, in terms of, can we go out and do that? Are we going to be able to bring money in order to expand? But I think there was enough of a case that we could say, actually, we need to do this anyway. Doing that kind of work not only enables us to expand, but also enables us to improve our insights, because we can work with people who, perhaps they aren't doing the same interventions as us. And that starts to enable us to compare how well things work. Perhaps we can work with people who are and get a larger kind of population for that intervention. But yeah, at the moment, it is kind of new money that came in.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. There's a couple of questions in the chat, and you might want to keep responding to these while we have our other speakers as well. But at polar opposite sides, you've got somebody asking about the practicalities of what your centre will look like in terms of roles. Who's in? Does this engulf people who are already kind of practitioners engaged in evaluation, or is this people who will be doing specific evaluation type jobs? And then there's another much wider question about cultural change and about what your ambitions are towards cultural change. I don't know if either one of those is a quick answer.
Do you want to have a quick go at one of them, Nathaniel?
Yeah, so which one? I'll go for the staff one, because I think I've been thinking a lot about that as well. So I think we've got funding for another full-time post. But what I'm really keen on, and I think this speaks to the culture as well, is about how we bring in champions of evaluation, or almost fellowship evaluators in the organisation itself. I'd really like to see kind of a champion person in each school, whether that sits within that student success role. And one of the other things that I'm really keen for is students. Like, how do we bring students into this in a really positive way, where they feel like they're partners and contribute? And I think speaking to some of the work at Sheffield Hallam about bringing in that kind of partnership working with student researchers, and kind of that was really key for both expanding kind of capacity within staff, within the faculties there, but also really useful for us and also really useful for the students. So there's lots of thoughts going for a definite post for a full member time staff, but I think it's about bringing staff in as well. And that's about, I think, speaks to the culture as well, about how you kind of take your network out of just this little centre, and making sure you've got those connections across the organisation. Do you want to speak a bit more about the cultural stuff, maybe, Jenny? I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
No, I mean, I think that is an important part for us, is trying to develop culture. And I think one of the things that we're thinking through and haven't really quite got to grips with at the moment is what's the relationship between the evaluation and trying to develop that culture. And we're also trying to develop more pedagogic research and really trying to think about what's the relationship between the two, and are they in tension? Are they supporting each other? How do we come across with a coherent message about the two as well? But we definitely want to make sure we know that a centre's not going to be able to do all of the evaluations. So it is about supporting people and upskilling them to be able to do it themselves.
Lovely. Thank you, Jenny. Yeah, sorry you had some technical issues through your presentation, but between yourself and Nathaniel, it was a really useful overview of what you're aspiring to do at Greenwich, but also that was kind of fundamental principles of that you're trying to enact there. There's lots of questions in the chat as well, if the two of you want to have a look at those, and particularly someone saying, how do we know whether we've achieved cultural change, is a key leadership question, I think. So thank you for asking that. So thank you. I hope you're going to stay around for the rest of the call, but we're going to move on to our second speaker. So David, I'll just read some an introduction. So Professor David Shepherd is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic at Sheffield Hallam University, and David provides senior leadership for the university's overall academic strategy, development and delivery. Previously, David was Pro Vice-Chancellor and Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences at Keele and Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Canterbury Christ Church University. Prior to his time at Keele, David was a senior member of staff at the University of Sheffield, where he founded the Bakhtin Centre and held a wide range of leadership roles, including Head of School of Modern Languages and Linguistics, Director of Research for Arts and Humanities, Director of the Humanities Research Centre. A Russianist by background, he has published extensively on Russian literature, culture and cultural theory. Who knew, David? So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us at this Evaluation Collective event. Really pleased that you can join us today. So again, we've got about 15 minutes, just over, if you want to take the floor.
Thanks very much, Liz, and thank you for the invitation. I've actually lurked on the Evaluation Collective's lists for a couple of years now, since I joined Hallam, but I claim absolutely no expertise personally in evaluation, and you'll have noticed the signal absence of the term in any of the generalized bio that Liz read out to you there. There's a little bit of method in that, which I hope will become clear as I move through what I'm going to say. I'm not, by the way, going to be sharing any slides. I also need to get the usual sort of apology, and I'm going to have to leave shortly after 11 o'clock. I'm afraid I do have other things to go to. I really apologize for that, but there was nothing else I could do about rearranging my diary. But it is a real pleasure to be here. It's great to see so many people on the call from across the nations of the United Kingdom. And it's, I'm particularly proud that it's being hosted here at Hallam because of the strength that we do have here in evaluation, led very more than ably by Liz, by Julian, of course. And let's not forget Nathaniel, because Nathaniel, I know you were at Hallam until not very long ago. So, I think we can claim some of the credit for embedding that evaluative mindset, not only here at Hallam, which I think it is where I think it is very successful, but I think obviously today is an illustration of how Liz and her colleagues are helping to do that beyond Hallam as well. I'm not going to talk about any particular initiatives on evaluation. If our Pro Vice Chancellor for Learning, Teaching and Student Success were here, I think she would want to talk about its role in TEF and also in access and participation planning in the way that Jenny has just very helpfully alluded to. But I won't go into too much detail on that. I want to think about it. I suppose it's in the space of culture and leadership culture and how we embed evaluative thinking in that. So this is all going to be a little bit abstract, for which I apologize in advance if it's not quite going to hit the mark. But evaluation's moment does seem to have come, doesn't it? We've already had, as Jenny says, we've got John Blake at the Office for Students. And if you're not subject to the attentions of the Office for Students, be thankful for that, I think, is what I would say to colleagues from outside of the English sector. Evaluation is very prominent in the OFS rhetoric, particularly around access and participation. I think the jury is out on the extent to which the OFS itself has an evaluative mindset about its own activities and the impact of those activities on the sector. But that's a something that I think we need to continue to push them on, and at least they have been evaluated by the House of Lords and been found to be to have some areas for possible improvement, shall we say. But this is not an OFS kicking exercise. I think it's actually very welcome that John has placed evaluation front and centre, because it presents a challenge to people in senior leadership roles. And I took to thinking about how good have senior leaders been at embracing evaluation, and how good have I personally been in the range of institutions that I've been at. You know, this is the 5th university that I've worked in, the 3rd in which I've had a relatively senior role. And I have been, as a result of that, you won't be surprised to hear, involved in or responsible for a fair number of significant exercises in organisational change. And it's probably fair to say, well, it is fair to say, that the majority of those did not have evaluation built in from the outset as part of the process, as an indispensable stage of that change process. So in the language of evaluation, there wasn't that precondition probably of a plausible theory of change. And I'm still not sure whether, as senior leaders in universities, we always bring the discipline of evaluation to those big organizational things that we do, as opposed to those responses to policy and funding imperatives. So I think that's something that we do need to think about. It's a little bit like trying to do a major IT project without any kind of user engagement, as it were. It's a huge missing piece. So I think, you know, my reflection and self-criticism on that is that we probably need to do more as senior leaders, always to have evaluation in its due place. And when we're doing really significant change, how do we know that we have achieved the benefits we're setting out to achieve before we embark on the next major change, which is what we're often criticised, sometimes rightly, by our colleagues for doing. However, if we do that, it's really important that we don't fall into the other obvious temptation, which is simply that we say, yes, we have done evaluation, we've ticked the box, but we don't actually act on it. When I was chatting to Julian about this, he calls it, I think, Julian, you referred to this as the challenge of the drawer report, the report that gets written and just filed away in the drawer and never picked up again. In Russia, that's what novelists used to do with things that they knew could never be read because of censorship. So a slightly different use of the drawer. They used to write for the drawer, as they say. And it's really important that we not fall into the trap, I think, of saying that, well, we've done it, so don't worry about it. We actually really must follow up and learn those lessons. And I'm not sure we're always as good at that as we could be. So it really should be important to us as senior leaders, because we need an assurance of the rigor of the processes that we're doing and of the benefits that we're doing. But also, I think it's something to do with our capacity to cope with ambiguity and uncertainty as leaders, and to help our organizations cope with those things. Because evaluation could well come up with not a simple binary yes or no answer. Has it worked? Has it not worked? It's going to come up with nuanced views if it's really successful, I think. And we need a clear articulation of what evaluation cannot tell us, as well as what it can tell us, so that it helps us but make the decisions, the difficult decisions we have to make, but is not in itself those decisions. And I think there's a really important distinction there between evaluation as a set of evidence, as opposed to the answer to the question, did it work, didn't it? Should we have done it this way? It won't always work that way, I don't think. We need to be ready, and this is a point that John Blake makes quite often about the access and participation plans. You need to be ready to tell that what you thought would succeed has actually failed, and that's fair enough. But I do think there's a tendency to shy away from an admission of failure sometimes and fall into a kind of defensive mindset. One of the bits of feedback I once got on an executive training course in response to my 360 feedback was somebody said to me, well, there's a bit of a theme of defensiveness coming through here, David. And I said, no, there isn't, which was not, and the scales fell from my eyes at that point. I realized that I was being too defensive, and it's really something that I've tried to avoid ever since. But there's something I think also about the academic world, and I'm an academic in origin. You heard from Liz, I started as a teacher and researcher and so on. And there can be an assumption that we're infallible as academics. I once joked to a colleague who was challenging me on why, as a senior leader at Keele, I'd made a bad decision. I said, well, it's a funny thing. I just lost the infallibility I had when I was an academic, when I became a senior leader. Academics will not, often are very reluctant to admit that they're wrong. And I think that's a cultural thing that we've got to get through as well. They always know best. And sometimes they do, by the way. Now, do I think that this means that we all have to possess high levels of evaluation literacy as senior leaders? I personally would say we need awareness, but not necessarily literacy or fluency. So speaking to Julian, again, I joked that I'm sure you've all heard variations on this. You'll know you've succeeded as evaluators when you're no longer needed, because that mindset will be so thoroughly embedded. I don't actually think we should be getting to that point, because that will be to allow it simply to fade into the background and cease to be the grist to the mill that it needs to be. It is important, I think, as a specialism, perhaps even, I mean, the word discipline, with at least some of the elements of academic discipline, as well as the element of rigor that we mean by discipline as well, which sort of takes me back a little bit into some of my disciplinary roots. You've heard there at the beginning, I was a modern linguist. I have an interest in literary and cultural theory as well as in language. And I do think that as senior leaders, we have to be aware of the fact that there are people, specialists in evaluation, who speak the language of evaluation fluently or at native or near native levels in a way that we shouldn't seek to aspire to, but that we should trust them to interpret for us. So I think there's a really important role of kind of interpreting and supporting that colleagues like you, real specialists in evaluation, can offer us as senior leaders. And the one final thing I'd say is I think it's really important, of course, and I use this lame joke all the time, for the evaluators to evaluate themselves. The meta level of the discipline of evaluation, that thinking about what it means and pushing it forward as the world becomes more complex, is a particularly important thing to me. I wrote a book about Russian metafiction, language, literature which is about its own creation and so on, many years ago. So I have a theoretical investment personally in the importance of thinking about these things that we do, because universities always should be learning organizations. Sorry, a bit of a ramble, but I hope that there's at least something in there, and I've not had a chance to see if any questions or challenges are coming through, but I'll have a quick look now.
Brilliant. Thanks, David. No, it's a really interesting insight into the reflections of senior leaders, and it's really appreciated, because we don't often get the time to reflect and think about these different perspectives. I'll open it up to see if there's any questions. I've got loads, but yeah, anybody that'd like to come in and ask David a question? Lots of support in the chat, David. For anybody who'd like to ask anything, just trying to keep up with the chat at the minute. Anything in there you'd like to respond to, David?
I've seen, so Luciana said,
Yeah.
I think it's a kind of portrait, a clear articulation of what it can tell us and what it can't tell us. How often do people engage in those discussions? I'm not sure that, I personally don't think, we engage in those often enough and challenge ourselves enough on that. For me, the risk is that we just turn evaluation into the thing that we do that gives us an answer, and then we move on from it. It's got to be the source of continuing conversations, and that can seem like kicking things into the woods. It isn't. It helps to make those decisions, but you've got to keep coming back to the grounds for those decisions and be prepared always to say, actually, maybe we did measure the wrong thing in the first place, and that's fine, because you then invest that in the future. It's back to that learning organization business. It's all, in a sense, you could say it's bleeding obvious, but one of the things I've found over the years in senior leadership roles is the patently obvious bears restating frequently, I think. And that can in itself have a novelty value. Saying what we already know can sometimes have a freshness in a different context. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, thank you, David. I've just got a really quick question, but I think there's another one in the chat about the use of language. I don't know if you wanted to pick up on that one. Can you see that one?
Yeah, I can see that one. Thanks. And also appreciate what Anthony says. You do, I think, yes, the rubber stamping thing was what I was trying to get at. That I think, you know, it's unfair if we put the pressure on evaluators just to rubber stamp what we wanted to know from the outset. View of the experts and the language of experts. For me, there's a challenge, I think, which is that if we want to get the evaluative mindset into an organization, that inevitably means people need to have a certain competence in the language of evaluation. They need at least to know what the terms mean and don't mean. But what I meant was, I don't think that we have to make everybody equally fluent in that. And particularly when you're in a senior role, unless, you know, certainly this is from my perspective in the role that I'm in, I don't think it's the best. I think if I were to try to become fluent in this language, I would probably fail because I've got too much else on my mind. And that would risk occluding the really important specialist insights that people who are engaged in evaluation and in reflection on evaluation all the time are able to bring to us. So it's about promoting that sort of teamwork and cross-organizational work, which is so important. So I hope that answers it. It's wanting to recognize that there are specialists, there are experts in this area, and that we should embrace and celebrate that, and not try to get so generalized with it that we lose sight of the true value of what the evaluative mindset can offer us.
Lovely. Thank you, David. I'm hoping that if you've got a couple of minutes, you might be able to have a look at some of the other ones that are in the chat
Sure,
before you
fine.
go. But thank you so much for your insights
Thank
and
you
your
very much
and
again
your
for the
time.
invitation.
I was really, when we put on an event to engage senior leaders, I knew that time would be a challenge.
Not a problem.
So thank you so much for that. There were
Pleasure.
lots of useful reflections in the chat as well. And please, anybody else on the call, if you also have reflections on ways of working, then please do feel that you can answer as well. Thank you, David. So we're going to move on to our third speakers. So we've got Emma Thomas, who's been supported by Sam Child as well today. So Emma, welcome to the call. I'll just do a bit of an introduction to both of our speakers, and then I'll pass over. So Emma is an expert in access and participation and has worked in the higher education sector in England and Australia. She has significant expertise in advising and supporting institutions in strategic development and operational delivery, particularly related to access and participation, including OFS regulation. She's led, supported and submitted over 20 successful access and participation plans with the OFS and previously OFFA. She continues to support institutions in the current round of APP and regularly works with Vice Chancellors and executive teams to ensure alignment and effective communication of the requirements of APP. Emma established the SEER, so Specialist Evidence Evaluation and Research Service, in 2019, which now provides evaluation, data analysis and research support to 24 smaller and specialist institutions as part of their APP commitments. And Sam, who's one of our founding members of the Evaluation Collective, is an evaluation manager at Applied Inspiration, an organisation that provides evaluation support to help institutions meet those regulatory requirements around APP, and regularly uses the whole provider approach toolkit with providers. And she's got over 10 years of experience of undertaking evaluation in educational settings, plus an ESRC funded MPhil and PhD specialising in creative evaluation methods. So I'm delighted that we've got more experts and more insights into working with our senior leaders in the call. So I'm going to pass over to Emma. Emma, do you have some slides you want to share for us today?
I do, yes, please. That's all right.
Over to you. Yep.
Thank you. There we go. Can I just get a quick...
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so it's currently a black screen.
It's currently a black screen. Okay, we'll try and...
So it may just be the internet's taking a moment. It's still a black screen.
Let me just try again.
It's always the tech, isn't it? And these things.
Oh, at the worst possible moments, isn't it?
Yeah.
Talk about effective communication, don't we?
Yeah, we can now see your
Right.
screen. You just need to put it into presenter mode.
Thank Thank you, Sam. Let's see if it'll handle the presenter mode.
If
Otherwise,
needed, I can share
with
my
this one.
screen.
That's fine. I think we'll just stick with that, and we've got yeah. I'm assuming if that's big enough for everyone to see. That's
Yeah.
all
Yeah,
right.
just
Yeah.
about. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks very much. Look, thank you very much for inviting us today, and I'm going to do my best to get through what we've got. How do I follow David? That was really refreshing and a good roundup of how we can think about evaluation from a senior leader perspective. I'm probably going to go a little bit the other way, and I've taken our brief today very literally, and I'm going to present to you how we at SEA have learned and approached talking to senior leadership about evaluation, the things that we think are important, as a little bit of a roundup of top tips, if that's all right. Just a little bit about SEA, because that's the important piece. We're now supporting over 25 smaller and specialist providers in that evaluation space, with their, particularly in relation to their access and participation plans. And through that work over the last 5-6 years, SEA has been going from 2019. You know, we really know and understand the importance of getting that SLT leadership support and getting them on board in terms of understanding really two key things about evaluation. One that seems to work is around the regulation link. So thinking about it in terms of the lens of regulation, but then moving beyond that almost to what we've been talking about here in terms of the value added that evaluation can bring. So we're always trying to move beyond that compliance angle. Well, we're using that sometimes as a little bit of a stick, I'll be honest, and it's still there in terms of its importance. Naturally, you know, moving beyond there towards that value added piece has been really important in the work that we do. And just to reflect on what Liz was saying at the beginning of the call, you know, you spoke, Liz, about how do we build an evaluation culture. You know, what we've been, I suppose, to sum that up a little bit, and what the presentation is going to be talking about a little bit today is three things. It's really about how you need to get the attention of senior leaders, keep the attention of senior leaders, and then make them want more. And then you get, you know, that's bringing in the funding and the investment and the culture change bit. So I'm going to present a little bit about how we might think about doing that. I've thought about this kind of framework as part data, part politics, and thinking about three considerations that should be aligned before you think about presenting data to senior leaders. One is around the parties. What do you want to achieve? What do they want to achieve? And understanding that. And what does the executive or higher education institution itself want to achieve? What's the message that you need to convey? What information do you need to convey that message? What information, so what's the best way to convey it? And what are the results? And this is the piece. This is a piece that says, you know, why is evaluation important? Well, we want to learn something. We want to do something with it. What do you want them to do with it? How could they do that? And presenting some solutions or options for them to consider. And what will be improved? So what's the benefit or impact of that evaluation? And we always try to think about it in those three kind of categories. And ultimately, you probably want to get a little bit of this. You want senior leaders to be thinking, okay, we want your ideas, we want to know what's happening from the evaluation, so we can lean on that tomorrow when we're submitting our broader plans. And then obviously it's starting to again embed into how the institution's moving forward and building and driving progress. So I've got five top tips, I hope, that we use as a SEA group when we talk to our members and thinking about what senior leaders need to know and need to think about. So number one is knowing your data inside out, back to front, and being clear and concise. Lifting the key points from your data and your findings, and support with just really sharp headline data. Lead with these points, and then we're providing detail underneath those. So you've got that attention grabbing piece, and then you're providing some of the detail. I always like, and particularly in a smaller specialist context with which we work, I always like to illuminate the data through storytelling. And I think that's really important, particularly in smaller specialist organisations where we're actually relying on lots of positive data rather than the figures. So storytelling and illumination, that's still important where there's lots of statistics. Leaders usually want something, a humanistic piece of the story to talk about and to tell and to repeat. Linked to other priorities. So we've talked a little bit about regulatory priorities, but there will be other strategic priorities across the institution. And state the so what. So what about the data? What is the data telling us, and therefore what does that mean, and how does that impact? And you might want to propose some short, sharp recommendations and possibilities for solutions. And as we've heard from David, acknowledging the limitations as well is incredibly important. We need senior leaders to know that actually there are parameters around this, and we may need further investigation, or we may need to be satisfied with a particular threshold with which the data can provide confidence. There's some things around being clear and concise as well, using non-technical and simple language. We've talked a little bit about that today already. And then I always find things useful to set in a framework or structure. So you might use, for example, a really pertinent example is using the student life cycle structure as a way to present data, for example. You might choose to use some simple visuals, but don't overcomplicate those. I usually find that WYSI, PowerPoint, and Prezi work doesn't help to convey a simple, short, sharp message. And don't present the nitty-gritty. It's not about getting into the whole detail of the evaluation, but you should be absolutely prepared to respond if those questions are asked about the detail, and you will be checked, and you will need to respond to more detailed questions. Just some small specialist considerations there. We need to make sure we do acknowledge that smaller data sets limits that inference and that applicability of data. Strength, however, in the quality of illumination. And we need to acknowledge as well in small specialist contexts that we're probably knowing deeply about a smaller cohort rather than knowing broadly and having lots of applicability to our findings. Number 2 is knowing your audience and speaking to them. Think about parties and goals. Who are the parties who are at the table, who is absent, but a key influencer who you also might need to speak to even in their absence? What's the level of familiarity with the evaluation processes and terminology? What's that data fluency like? That we've already talked a little bit about that today. And what are the goals that sit behind those parties? And even sometimes the goals that sit behind the goals of the parties. Understanding that context really helps you to frame what you're saying in terms of presenting your data and how it links to the key priorities of the people you are speaking to. Those goals could be anything from regulatory, i.e. financial, academic, humanistic, managerial, reputational. When we're thinking about things from a regulatory point of view, you might be talking about data that pinpoints an area to address that would affect our B3 condition outcomes, for example. Financial, you might be talking in the sense that you are looking at data which could prevent attrition, which would affect our retention of our fee income. From an academic perspective, you might be thinking about the theme of the evaluation and what it says from an academic perspective. So, for example, bringing in the theme of sense of belonging. From a humanistic point of view, we might be talking more about the personal experiences of students, and particularly, for example, around student mental health, which might affect outcomes. Managerially, you might be thinking about efficiency and efficiency savings. How can data really focus your resources and maybe help to weed out some of the things that aren't working? And that's important too. That is also in terms of managerial perspective and a financial perspective. And then reputational. I'll never forget my DVC that I worked for some time ago, who just wanted to know the key headlines so she could repeat them in the various fora that she was presenting at. By doing X, we were achieving Y, and the impact went from A to B. And there were those really high-level headline reputational statements that she could make. So thinking about how you position those priorities and those goals in terms of speaking about your evaluation is really important. Making sure those alignments between your priorities for communicating your evaluation and their priorities for their role and responsibilities. In small specialist organisations, you're more likely to know your audience. That might be a bit easier. They're less likely to be data savvy. There will be lots of priorities among a very few leaders, so they're often balancing those priorities. It might be good for you to speak to them as an overall. And there will be a priority around efficiency, I think, wherever we look at the moment. Number 3 is a little bit linked to that. It's about knowing your institution. There's parties and the institution as a party, aligning with the overarching priorities of the institution. Understanding the mission and priorities of the institution, regulatory compliance, mission and vision, brand and values, speaking to some of the things I just talked about for the parties area. Connecting those findings to their strategic goals. Emphasising the impact of findings and therefore really communicating without having to directly say it, the value of evaluation, the ongoing value of evaluation. And again, illuminating that data with some examples of application. And that might include some reference to any competitive advantage or best practice alignment that you can infer. Small specialists, again, leaders balancing all or most of those priorities. So alignment is definitely key. How can we make sure that what we're doing in evaluation in APP also serves some of the TEF ideas? In SEER, where we've already launched a pilot looking at measuring educational gain, which we're looking at from an APP perspective, but we're bringing in obviously the TEF requirement there as well. We've got that pilot rolling out in 7 of our SEER members at the moment. There may be strong links to other external priorities such as industry or discipline areas, and there's big great opportunities to bring those priorities to life, telling the story via that qualitative data. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to just be quick across these last 2 slides. Be solution orientated. If I learn one thing, it's around don't bring problems without the solutions. The purpose of evaluation is to absolutely understand what works, so we must link it with what is going to work. So in concluding your talking about evaluation, we've always found that actually highlighting what are the actionable recommendations, what are the potential solutions, and you might provide some options for those. So there is that ability for senior leaders to be part and parcel of the conversation and offer different viewpoints, and offer a clear plan for options and options for implementing. Make sure that your audience leaves with a clear understanding of what to do next, and that's really important. Small specialist providers, we are limited in terms of the staff base, so there are likely to be very few decision makers, which limits maybe the diversity of the response. We need to be mindful of that. However, there is lots of agility to respond to findings quickly, which means that as evaluators, we often see the recommendations flowing through into practice, which is lovely. A constraining factor, however, is there is often less resource, so we need to be really mindful about that when we're presenting options. And finally, seek input. Bring your audience along with you, open and facilitate and welcome discussion. We just talked a little bit about that defensiveness. I think there needs to be that recognition that actually this is a joint conversation. It's a collaborative and open conversation where there will be different viewpoints, particularly in small specialists, where we tend to find that actually the staff know their students very, very well, and they would have different lenses to bring to the data. It's almost another layer of participatory evaluation that we're bringing to it. Be comfortable with the tough questions. They will happen, but don't feel pressured to answer them on the spot. Actually, there might be a question there that you can leverage to say, well, actually, this requires further investigation. Here's how we might do that. Again, supporting that idea of a culture evaluation and ongoing and iterative evaluation, and setting that expectation for ongoing dialogue. I'll leave it there because I've just gone slightly over, and I'll hand back. Liz, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. That was a really good balance between some of the conversations that we've had at the beginning of this session, and the more abstract points, to the real detail of and practical, which I know that our audience would love, insights into the things we need to think about when we're talking to senior leaders about evaluation. Probably got a little bit of time before we pass over to our final speaker for questions. If anybody wants to ask Emma and Sam anything. Stunned into silence, Emma. I wondered whether you'd got any thoughts on institutions which might say that evaluation, that we don't have time. We don't have time for evaluation, and evaluation it's sometimes a stall, and it because of the pace of decision making, and sometimes at a senior leadership level? I'm playing devil's advocate because that's not something I would say, but I just wondered if you'd come across any of those kind of conversations.
Yeah, I mean, being time poor is absolutely an issue, and especially in smaller specialists where we've got, as I say, a limited number of staff members who have got multiple priorities and multiple roles basically wrapped into one. I think I would go back to leaning on the value of evaluation, but talking about it in the terms of how it links to and aligns to their broader priorities and goals. And so the idea of the parties and the goals bit is for me the kind of crux between getting that attention, retaining that attention, and getting them to want more. It's about, you know, allocation of time is simply a priority. If you can, it's a prioritization process. So if you can link your evaluation and the process of evaluation with the bits in their repertoire that come at that high priority, then you're more likely to get that time afforded to you and afforded to the evaluation as a culture and as a method ongoing. But sometimes you've got to lean on the regulatory stuff as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be a useful hook, can't it? Yeah, and a lot of people have talked about that today. Yeah, lovely. I don't know whether we've got time for any more questions, Emma. So because I'm conscious we don't want to run out of time for our final speaker, but there is lots in the chat as well. If people have got any other questions for Emma, the points are in there that you can use the chat, and we will be sharing the slides and the recording afterwards. So anybody wants to catch up on what Emma's said, those really practical points for us. Okay, so we're going to move on to our final speaker. John, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to read abridged version of your bio, which was very long. I'm going to do a bit of an introduction for John, and then we've got the rest of the time in the session today to go through your content. So we're delighted to have Professor John McKendrick with us this afternoon, a Professor of Social Justice at Glasgow Caledonian University, where he co-directs the Scottish Poverty and Equality Research Unit. He arrived at university 25 years ago, having spent the first 4 years of his career at the University of Manchester. And his work at the university was interrupted with 2 years on secondment at the University of Edinburgh. Professor McKendrick was appointed Commissioner for Fair Access in January 2023 by the Scottish Government. And I'm sure he can tell you the kind of intricacies of that role, which sounds fascinating, both for those of us that are working in the English context, but also thinking about the connections and the comparisons with what's happening in Scotland and beyond. So John, over to you. We've got about 15 minutes for a presentation, some insights, and then some time for questions at the end. So thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Liz. Just to check, Liz, can you see the slides on the screen?
We can. They're not in slideshow, but we can see them fine. Or you can pop them into slideshow if you can.
This is a test of my competency, and I'm failing miserably.
It's probably going to work fine as it is if you wanted to just click through them.
Yeah, for some reason, and I'm not giving a cop out here, it doesn't seem to be giving me the option of slideshow. So is it okay if we can just run with that?
Yeah, of course it is. Yeah.
Many apologies, everybody. So yeah, delighted to get the chance to talk to you and more importantly, to listen and learn from you. As Liz says, I'm Commissioner for Fair Access in Scotland. I've got a few slides, nothing too heavy. I, of course, come from the land of milk and honey, otherwise known as Scotland, or so we like to promote ourselves. I think we're very good in Scotland at having aspirations. These are ambitious, and as we would probably see in many domains, progressive aspirations. In Scotland, we have a commitment to eradicate child poverty by 2030. By 2030, we have a commitment to narrow the poverty-related attainment gap in schools. And specifically regard to this agenda, we have this 2030 commitment to achieve fair access to higher education, which in terms of a KPI, in terms of a targeted measure, is that 20% of first degree, first time entrants to universities will be from the 20% most deprived areas in Scotland by 2030. So I think there's a lot of progressive thinking. There's a lot of goodwill towards this. It tends to be perhaps in contrast to the UK as a whole. There's more a collective sense of purpose. For example, these 3 commitments, 2030 commitments, were agreed with universal support across the political spectrum in Scotland. It's not to say that everybody agrees entirely, but there was universal support for these 3 measures. And I think that child poverty one is really important because The commitment in Scotland to eradicate child poverty by 2030 was introduced in 2017, which was 1 year after the UK government reneged on a very similar commitment. And yet the Conservatives in Scotland were able to support this initiative in the jurisdiction of Scotland. So I think we live in a different context. It's far from perfect, but I think we do have a sense of purpose, a sense of trying to promote fair access and social justice in ways that perhaps are less characteristic of other parts of the UK. You'll be familiar with the idea about, you know, hitting the target and missing the point. Well, I put a slightly different twist on that, if you like, about missing the target is not necessarily missing the point. And I maybe have to explain myself a little bit here. So we have this 2030 target, this 20% of entrants from the 20% most deprived areas by 2030. And while it's my job to pester universities and government and others that are involved in that work to make progress towards it, I don't think you know, that the most important thing is the target itself. It's important, I think, that we strive towards it, but not hitting that target is not necessarily a measure of failure, because it's all about the things that we do to achieve that target. And the target in itself is imperfect. It's an area-based measure rather than an individual-based measure. And I'm happy to take questions and share my reflections on that if you like. But as I say, making progress is important. If we're not making progress, then we have a problem. But not meeting that target is actually probably over-ambitious, if I'm honest about it, because we live in the real world. And in the real world, the people in the 20% most deprived areas have got a lot of challenges that they face. And to achieve equity is actually much more ambitious than any other country has set. So I don't think missing a target is a crisis. I think not making progress is a real problem. I wouldn't necessarily shout from the rooftops about not missing the target has not been a problem, but I think it's important we get a sense of perspective about what we're trying to achieve, and certainly not to make it too party political broadcast. And as Bananarama I've mentioned as well, it's not just about the target. For those of you of a certain age will get that reference. For those of you of an even older age, you might be thinking Ella Fitzgerald, because the point, the song was, it ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. And I think really importantly, I think is the way that we do widen access and promoting fair access is important. It's not just about the fact that we're doing it. It's not just the fact that we've got the right target, but it's how we actually approach that, how we live that, I think is a critical factor. And that brings in a whole lot, as I'll go into maybe suggest, it brings in a whole lot more people involved in this agenda than perhaps we have allowed ourselves to think so far. I think there's a tendency for us to think about widening access and the targets related to it belong to the university executive on one hand and the widening access practitioners on the other. Two groups at very different ends of the spectrum within the university workforce, both of which seem to have a responsibility for the agenda. I think that has to change. I think we absolutely need the execs on board. You need that leadership that's driving it forward as being part of what our institution is. And you need the widening access practitioners to facilitate that work. But I think much more of the university workforce needs to see this as part of their routine responsibilities. And I know I'm a practicing academic. You know, I'm just out of exam boards or in the middle of exam boards this week. I'm just through with the marking for my academic year. I know the workloads that are involved. I know that we juggle admin. We've got a research life that we want to pursue, as well as to be the very best teachers that we possibly can be. I know the arts are great, but I really, truly believe that much more of your routine rank and file academics need to see this as part of their everyday practice. We need to be reflecting in practice as part of that work to achieve fair access, and not just see it as something that the bean counters, you know, the KPI generators are concerned with. It's not. It's about how we do things. It's about how we deliver our access, our practice, and also how we sell universities to a broader population. And that, of course, is becoming much more of a moot issue in the UK, given messages that have been communicated in the last few weeks about the devaluing of university degrees and the fact there's a quest then to drive this out. Again, interestingly, back to the land of milk and honey, that's just not a debate that's taking place in Scotland. It's just not on the agenda. It's not our way of thinking. That's not to say that nobody's concerned with access and quality. Absolutely we are. It's just the tenor of debate is very, very different north of the border. And a kind of final point I want to make, and I want to leave plenty of time for questions, is that in Scotland, this has not been a difficult agenda to sell. You know, the idea of promoting fair access to universities is really difficult to argue against. You know, the idea that people with talent and potential should be afforded the opportunity to realise that potential is really not a difficult argument to present to others who need to be convinced. And we're maybe in a unique place in Scotland. I like to think that we're not, but we might be in a slightly unique place in that your red brick universities, your vice principals of your Edinburghs, your St Andrews and your Glasgows are firmly behind this agenda. Now, we might think it might be your post-92 universities that are the champions of this agenda because it's hardwired into the DNA of what these institutions are. And it is. But I think really interestingly, some of the loudest voices for promoting fair access in Scotland are actually those from the red brick universities. Some of the significant progress that's been made in widening fair access has been made in our red brick universities. And indeed, some of our very best retention rates amongst those from the most deprived areas is to be found once again in our red brick universities. So I think that there are plenty of ways in which I think we can appeal to executives to make it clear that this should be part of what we are. And there is good evidence from Scotland that by broadening the range of people who access university, it does not have an adverse impact on what that institution is. It doesn't lead to a collapse of your rankings in the Times Higher Ed in terms of where we stand nationally or globally. Edinburgh and Glasgow can evidence the case that a broadening of who gets access to universities can enrich. It's actually more consistent with what the institution is about. And that's about, in those cases there, it's about providing the opportunity for excellence to be realised. So I think we're in an interesting place in Scotland. It's a very different context. I don't think it's all perfect. In some respects, what we have south of the border, with a commitment then to have your reports on fair access and also a stronger evidence base. Almost interestingly, you have a stronger evidence base and a more commitment to research and evaluation south of the border. I think there's almost been an implicit sense that what we do has been impactful north of the border, and we need to sharpen up on that in the years ahead. So evaluation, I think, has got a more important role to play going forward. We're fortunate with people like Alison Browett, who's on the call there, who's championing that idea of focusing on an evaluation and looking at it in a hard-nosed way. I think there's scope for more of that to take place. So hopefully I've left a little bit of time for questions, but if I've not, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me afterwards. I'd be delighted to speak to you either now or beyond. Thanks, Liz.
Brilliant. Thanks, John. Yeah, we've got 5 minutes or so for questions. That's absolutely fine. So thank you for your presentation and for your insights. We've had a fascinating range of speakers today from within institutions, and then you've really broadened that out for us to think about the kind of engagement in the policy landscape as well. If you want to pop your slides off so I can see folk if they've got questions, that would be helpful. And if people can also pop stuff in the chat, thank you. But I had a question just while people are thinking about things that they might want to ask, which was to go back to your slide, which I found really refreshing, about focusing on progress, not target. Which I think is a really, really interesting way of looking at things in a sector where and institutions where we are driven by our KPIs. Is it possible to say a bit more, thinking about that kind of evaluative lens of how you're making progress, and whether that's whether that's good enough, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it's not easy. If you've got a KPI that shows the numbers have been up, it's kind of easier to evidence or convince somebody that the progress has been made. But I think there's also an evidence in practice. And again, it seems as if I'm here, promoting Scotland and celebrating Scotland, but we have celebrated activity. We have celebrated process in Scotland. 2 publications a decade apart are worth drawing attention to, though. In 2014, Access All Areas, published by University of Scotland, was a collection, and this predates the formal target, a range of initiatives that were taking place across all of the 19 HEIs in Scotland to widen access to higher education. So it was celebrating the activities, not necessarily talking about the numbers, but celebrating the work that's done and the range of work that's been done with a range of different age groups to facilitate access to universities and widen access. And then more recently, and it was actually very recently because it formally will be launched in the autumn, is a 40 Faces report. Now we know about the equivalent that we have report in down south at Universities UK is releasing, but the University of Scotland focus in the 40 Faces is about those that are fair access students and their journeys through education. So we're celebrating the processes. We're looking at, what's been undertaken to achieve those outcomes, as well as the outcomes as well. There's still a focus in the numbers, and there is a bottoming out. That progress that was made a few years ago has not been realised in the last few years. I think we have a mature debate round about that. In the Parliament, we had a debate by the Minister for Higher Education, Further Education and Veterans to discuss the annual report and discuss the progress that was made. And the Ministers convened a meeting in 2 weeks' time, no, next week, sorry, with myself and the Vice Principals of universities to discuss what has to be done, what could be done to make progress towards the target. So it's not that it's not part of the agenda, it's just it's not the totality of the agenda. We're interested in the actions as well as the numbers.
Yeah, thank you, John. And there's a brilliant sentence by Ashley in the chat, which is progress, not targets, is the regulation of dreams, which I think should be the strap line for this session that we're having today, which is a lovely sentiment. Thank you. Anybody else got any?
Can I just jump
Yeah,
back
of course
in
you
that
can. Yeah.
I agree with that, but targets have been, they've been really important in Scotland because it's given a sense of purpose to the agenda. I think if we didn't have that target, we wouldn't have the strength of commitment to the agenda. It would still be there because it predated the target, but it gives a sense of purpose. And as long as we're not fixated with the target and we use that target to good effect, then I think that's important. And the measure of the target is very narrowly defined and slightly problematic in Scotland, but it's enabled us to do a wider range of widen access activities. So again, I think understanding and using targets rather than being held to them and being slave to the target is really important.
And there's a follow-up question by Sandra in the chat, which is about the kind of iterative continuous improvement. So do we need moving targets, for example? So are all those targets fixed?
This is a question and a plate for me. One of the original recommendations that the universities in Scotland had is that all institutions would work towards 10% of their students being from the most deprived areas. Now, it doesn't take a mathematician to work out that 10% is quite considerably lower than 20%, and it would never get us to where we needed to do if that was the target. And also, if you know your geography, that's an easy target if you're from Glasgow, because by virtue of your surrounding area, you're going to meet the target, and it's an almost impossible target from the northeast of Scotland, given your surrounding area. Now, the specific approach that I made in my report in January is rather than have this fixed target, we should have a moving target, just as the question suggests, and that every one of the HEIs in Scotland could aim to meet their very best that they've achieved so far and make progress going forward. So it's a moving target that I'm recommending is year-on-year progress for every institution. Because I think just now what we've had, and if I'm honest about it, my institution is part of this, we've let some institutions off the hook. My institution happens to be very good at promoting fair access. The University of Glasgow happens to be very good at promoting fair access, but it's not really been held to account in that because the target means absolutely nothing. Whereas my recommendation is different. It's saying that every institution should be constantly making progress or meeting the very best that they've met previously. So I completely agree that a moving target is really important. Not just an interim target toward an end goal, but a target that moves for institutions as we approach that.
Lovely. Thank you, John, for that articulation. Any other questions from the floor? Alison, yeah, of course you can.
Thank you for your presentation, John, for representing the Scottish sector, and thank you for the shout out to me as well. That's very kind of you. As you know, my work is quite localised and also have been supporting the practitioners in Scotland in their evaluation kind of journeys. So it's really good to hear that you are meeting with ministers and the people in charge and the heads of institutions to talk about the progress. But do you expect during those discussions that evaluation and how we actually demonstrate that we're making progress will be part of those discussions?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the other groups has been invited along as a widen access managers. Sally Middleton, who represents that group, will be also part of the meeting as well. And it absolutely has to be. And it's also about looking at things in the round. The KPI is very narrow, and it's good because it gives us, I say, that collective sense of purpose. It gives us something to focus on. But it's a broader range of work that we undertake in Scotland. And one of the the feelings that I have is we undersell ourselves in the range of activity and the breadth of progress that we have made, because we're only focused on one particular metric. It doesn't allow us to tell that bigger, broader story. And that bigger, broader story needs evaluation. It needs evaluation of individual projects as well, because if we're concerned then that we have a national schools programme, and if we want to know how impactful that national schools programme work is, we need to evaluate. We can't just assume that because numbers move in a certain direction, it's the activity in the national schools programme that's made a difference. It might be nothing to do with that. It might be work that's been on in schools completely independently of it. It might be transformation in families, well-being that's led them to be more inclined to provide opportunity for their kids. Lots of things can contribute to it. And if we don't evaluate, we run the risk of not using the pounds and pence that we are able to invest in this agenda wisely. So absolutely, Alison, it's got to be a strong focus of what we do is maintaining that evaluation focus. And it is one of my recommendations, is I think it's something we need to look at in Scotland about getting involved. I, for the life of me, can't understand why Scotland doesn't have world-leading education researchers that specialise in widening access. Given that we've a 2030 target, have had it since 2016. We've got little odds and sods of people that are doing it. And people like Alison, Lawrence, Lascelles at St Andrews doing a power of good work. But I think there's much more opportunity in Scotland for this type of work to be undertaken, proper evaluation. But importantly, and I think this is something that we're better at south of the border, perhaps than north of the border, sharing lessons of what's not learned as well. What's not worked. We're not very good at that. We're very good at telling you, putting on a Sunday best and telling you what works very well. And I think we have to be much more mature about acknowledging what's not worked so well and seeing that as a responsibility of us to share that with others. There was a question I picked up in the chat. Can I come back on it, Liz? It was just
Yep.
What if progress targets go the wrong way? That's timely, because I reckon the next set of stats will be showing that the progress is going the wrong way, or indeed if it's not making progress, in my mind, is also not going the right way because it's not increasing the proportions. I think it'll be interesting how we handle that. There's a technical way of responding to that and talking about indicators, but if I leave that aside for the minute and just focus on the fact that progress has not been made, how do we handle that issue? We've got to handle it maturely. We've got to understand the broader context and factors that might have led to that progress not being achieved. We don't want to reach the conclusion that the types of activities we're doing must not be working. Perhaps it's not a worthwhile agenda to pursue, or perhaps have reached the maximum potential for us for widening access. Again, I think it might have, by way of introduction, mentioned that I'm co-director of the Scottish Poverty and Inequality Research Unit. I'm also in Scottish Government's Child Poverty Board, that broader target for tackling child poverty. And this broader context is absolutely pertinent. If we have been through a cost of living crisis, if we have been through, the trials and tribulations of COVID-19, that absolutely will have an impact on those from the most deprived backgrounds more than most. It might have been reasonable to expect that we didn't make progress over the last few years, and actually holding your own is actually a marker of success rather than anything else. Now, that's an argument. It's not an evidence argument, but it's an argument I think that has to be made. And the point being that when things don't look as if they're working, we have a mature reflection on it. We don't become defensive, and we absolutely don't withdraw from the agenda. But we look at, right, is that a sign of progress? Is that a sign of failure? Is that a sign of a problem? And if it is, take action to address that. But don't just automatically assume that because progress hasn't been made, then that's a sign that things have went wrong. I say it might be beyond the realm of education to deal with the fact that progress has slowed down. So I'll be in a better place to answer that, and I think in 6 months' time, once the results come out and we have a debate from it. But I'm optimistic, and 99.9% confidence that it won't lead to any weakening of commitment to this agenda if the results look slightly worse than the government would like them to next time around.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John, for your reflections and your time to join us today, and for your insights into and reflections into what's happening in Scotland. It's absolutely refreshing to hear the approach that you're taking, and your kind of pragmatic approach to targets and progress is lovely. We're going to have to call it time. We've been here for an hour and a half, and it's been a lovely conversation about leadership, of evaluation. I'm really hoping that people have got a lot from that. We've had lots of questions in the chat. We've had lots of different perspectives, and it's been a really, really useful conversation. We'll make sure that the slides are shared. We'll make sure that the recording is up on our Evaluation Collective website, and I'll email that out to members. Thank you to all our speakers, and for those of you that have joined us today, have a lovely rest of the day. Thanks, everybody.
Yep.